Hello, I'm Essie Fox, and welcome to my podcast, Talking the Gothic, delving into the darkest realms that stir our blood and thrill our souls in much the way we might have felt when reading fairy tales as children. Fairy tales still inspire me. Some have haunted me for years, and now they've re-emerged as themes in my adult Gothic novels, such as Elijah's Mermaid, with allusions to Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid and Charles Kingsley's Water Babies, or Snow White and Rose Red, most recently used in The Fascination. Art has inspired me. My debut novel, The Somnambulist, alludes to work by the Pre-Raphaelite artist Millet. His A Somnambulist shows a sleepwalking woman dressed in a nightgown as she walks at the edge of a precipitous cliff, clearly in danger of falling to her death at any moment on the sea-swept rocks below. I mention that work because it really does encapsulate the central imagery found in so many Gothic novels. A young person, usually female, lost or abducted, with their life at danger, and if not their life, then the corruption of their body or their soul or both, with this sleepwalking theme of someone being blinded to the dangers of the wickedness of life, whether they're blinded through lies or deception or being drugged into compliance, or via some supernatural influence, with sleeping and dreams once considered as the way by which spirits of the dead could communicate with the living. But these are just a few of the common Gothic tropes, a literary genre that many scholars now believe was first defined by Horace Walpole when he wrote his horror novel called The Castle of Otranto. And that's what I'll talk about today in quite some detail, because it is such an important formative text. And if you don't know the story and you're planning to read it, I'll warn you that I'm going to give a short description of the story, so that will contain some spoilers. Published in 1764, The Castle of Otranto was groundbreaking in its time, melding a tale of dark romance with supernatural events and creating a style that's still popular today, perhaps more lately having morphed into the fantasy romances that dominate bestseller lists and many of our bookshop shelves. I also, though, view Walpole's book as somewhat Arthurian, with knights and courtly settings, and with the chivalry of knights saving damsels in distress. But it's also harking back to themes of Shakespeare's plays, putting the reader in mind of tragedies like Macbeth, when ambition for power ultimately leads to downfall. Walpole himself often claimed that his book had been inspired after one night when he'd suffered from a terrible nightmare, but he also spread the rumour that the novel had been based on an ancient manuscript found on the library shelves of a secluded stately home somewhere in the north of England, having arrived there from Naples in the darkest Middle Ages. Dangling such tantalizing lures, he wrote his story in a style that certainly is quite archaic. It's even comical at times, whether that's intentional or not, such as early in the text, when Prince Manfred, who's the ruler of the Castle of Otranto, is about to attend the wedding of his only son to the Princess Isabella. But before the marriage starts, Manfred hears some panicked shouts, and here I'll quote from the book. "Oh, the helmet, the helmet!" The first thing that struck Manfred's eyes was a group of his servants endeavouring to raise something that appeared to him a mountain of sable plumes. Well, what Manfred is looking at is a gigantic metal helmet decorated with black feathers, and underneath it is his son, crushed and mangled and bloody and indisputably dead. As if this vision isn't unnerving enough on its own, Manfred then realizes that the helmet looks exactly like another one that's made of marble, and it's on the head of a statue in the Church of St. Nicholas, and it's a statue in honor of a knight who was known as Alfonso. Believing a magician has caused the tragedy, when Manfred sees a young peasant lurking near the marble statue in the church, he accuses him of witchcraft, and the reader also learns of an ancient prophecy that cryptically warns that the castle and lordship of Otranto shall pass from the present family whenever the real owner should be grown too large to inhabit it. Ignoring such a peculiar warning, Manfred demands this young man's death, saying he's surely a necromancer and he must be imprisoned himself underneath the gigantic helmet, either suffocating there or dying from starvation. Next, he comes up with the idea of preserving his own bloodline by marrying the Princess Isabella himself. However, there is one problem because Manfred's already married to the Princess Hippolyta, his very kind and long-suffering wife. And then there is the fact that Isabella's horrified herself when Manfred calls her to his chamber and announces his intention, claiming the death of his son will only bring happiness because when he marries Isabella, she'll surely bear him another. Isabella's shock at this and her growing dread is enhanced when the giant black feathers of the helmet are rustling at the window of the room, and then the sound of eerie sighing. And a portrait of the knight Alfonso that's hanging on the wall appears to move and come to life, leaving Manfred to ask if he is in a waking dream. This is a chilling scene, and the tension winds yet tighter when Isabella flees and is lost in dark passages that run below the castle, hearing creaks of rusty hinges and more ghostly sighs, which actually turn out to belong to the youth, Theodore, who was under the helmet before in this sort of very strange, archaic prison, but he's managed to escape, and now he helps the princess climb through a trapdoor to find her way to sanctuary in the church. And there, a friar called Jerome leaves her where he says orphans and virgins are safest. And then, in a great anger, he goes to visit Manfred, berating the prince for incestuous thoughts towards the girl who actually was as good as a daughter before the death of his son that very morning. Here it gets a little complex, with Theodore being recaptured and sentenced by Manfred to death by beheading, before which Manfred's daughter, the Princess Matilda, has seen the handsome young man and notes that he looks just the spitting image of the portrait of Alfonso. When Theodore's then forced to kneel and his shirt falls from his shoulder, Friar Jerome sees a birthmark on his flesh in the shape of an arrow, after which he confesses he once fathered a son who had exactly that same mark. Jerome explains that he was born as a count, which means that Theodore can also claim his noble blood as protection. Manfred agrees, with very little argument really, but only if Jerome will give Isabella up to him. And this decision coincides with the sudden appearance of Frederick, Isabella's father, who has returned to Otranto after spending many years fighting in the Crusades after his daughter's mother died in childbirth. As trumpets are blaring through the castle, Prince Frederick insists that Manfred is a usurper with no true right to the castle, and he also claims that Manfred has tricked his daughter's guardians, with whom he'd left her, into giving his beautiful daughter to Manfred's very weakly son Conrad. As Manfred tells Frederick then in turn of his desire for Isabella, now that Conrad's dead, Princess Matilda, Manfred's daughter, takes the opportunity to go and free Theodore from the ominous Black Tower in which he's been imprisoned. Then we have a scene of swooning passion between the two young people, ending with Theodore's liberation, while insisting he will come back again as a knight some future day and ask her father for her hand in marriage. But as he makes his escape through the darkness of a forest, he meets again with Isabella, and in an act of chivalry, while protecting her from capture by a knight who has followed them, he accidentally wounds this knight, and then discovers, unfortunately, when the helmet is removed, that this is Frederick come in search of his own daughter. The two young people then carry the wounded Frederick back to the castle, and there, despite awful wounds, he sees Matilda and falls madly in love and wants to marry her, to which Manfred then again agrees quite easily, though he has no thought for his daughter's own future. He's only using her as a chattel in exchange to get his own way and marry Isabella. Well, here comes another twist in the turbulent plot, for the severely injured Frederick sees the gruesome vision of a skeletal ghost telling him he has no right to marry Matilda and to leave her alone. Meanwhile, suspecting that Theodore and the Princess Isabella are in the church meeting again and even perhaps making love, Manfred creeps up on them and, in a raging anger of jealousy, he stabs the girl for betrayal as he then has to face the truth of having murdered his own daughter, because this isn't Isabella, it's Matilda. And then at that point, the gigantic vision of a knight appears again and proclaims that Theodore is the true heir of Otranto, after which there's a dramatic flash of lightning, a rumbling of thunder, and a monstrous rattling of armour, with the walls of the castle shattering in a terrifying climax. Before the giant disappears, the restless ghosts of Alfonso rising to heaven in a blaze of glory, the dead knight points to Theodore and proclaims again he's the true heir. And Jerome then explains how when Alfonso left the castle for the Holy Land himself, he met a woman on his travels, fell in love, and planned to marry her when returning home again. But unbeknownst to him, he left the poor woman pregnant, and Alfonso then died, and his lover died in childbirth, with her daughter being the very woman who ended up living in an area near the Castle of Otranto, where Jerome, who was a count at the time, loved her, and she gave birth to Theodore. Unfortunately, not that long afterwards, Theodore and his mother were kidnapped by pirates. But that's why Jerome then devoted his life to the church and gave up his noble status. But it explains why Theodore's claim to the castle is complete. He is the grandson of Alfonso. The humble tyrant Prince Manfred and his wife Hippotila now leave the castle grounds to devote themselves to a life of piety. At the same time, Theodore is hailed Prince of Otranto, and though he is very much in mourning for Matilda, he marries Isabella, and, like the best fairy tales, they will live happily ever after. Well, I'm sure you'll agree this all sounds a little silly. And indeed, the book was savaged by critics in its time, but it went on to be immensely popular. And what an influence it's had, going on to inspire the Gothic genre that we know and love today, blending twisting, turning plots with shocking coincidences, supernatural events, secret passages and doorways and dripping crypts and prison dungeons and menacing forests and caves, or with truly bloody deaths amongst the simmer of desire and shocking sexual transgressions. And if that hasn't whetted your appetite to find out more, I'm going to discuss the novel a little bit more now with the literary supremo that is Dr. Tim Rideout. Hello, Tim, and welcome to Talking the Gothic.
Hi, Essie. It's so good to see you. I'm really pleased to be here. So thank you for the invitation.
That's my pleasure. I'm so pleased you could join me. And I'd like to tell everybody who's listening that Tim is particularly well known as a brilliant interviewer at many literary events, but he's also a writer. And Gothic precarity, fear and anxiety in the 21st century fiction is coming out this September with the University of Wales Press. And I really do hope we'll have a chance to talk more with Tim about that at the time of publication. But in the meantime, maybe, Tim, you can just briefly tell us what the book's all about.
Yes, of course. And we'll talk about this when we talk about the Castle of Otranto, but the center of my interest in the Gothic is the Gothic as a political mode, as a political form of writing. So my book, Gothic Precarity, is the first study to look at how contemporary Gothic literature is engaging with the precarious conditions of our age. So things like economic instability, environmental collapse, political violence, forced migration, all those things that have eroded traditional structures of security and safety and making people feel existentially insecure. And in a nutshell, my proposition is it's the Gothic genre or mode of all literary forms that is the one that's best placed to engage with that phenomenon and to help us understand it and to decode it a little bit. So that's it in a nutshell. So I could talk much at length about the book.
Well, we
Um,
will. We definitely will later this year when it comes out for sure. I'm so looking forward to reading this. It sounds like it's going to be
Thank you.
absolutely fascinating. So thanks for that. And yes, well, back to the Castle of Otranto. I first read this book when I was at university. When did you first read it, Tim?
So I'm a latecomer to it. I think you probably know this. I undertook a master's in English literature maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And I read it then. It wasn't on the syllabus, but I wanted to get my comprehensive grounding in Gothic. And of course, it's the kind of uber Gothic text, the literary foundation stone, if you like. So I read it then. So I am a latecomer to it, and I've always had the kind of historicist view of it. I've always thought about it in terms of its place in Gothic, but also the timing of its publication.
Yes, definitely, definitely. Yes, with everything else, all other events going on at the time. But
Quite. Yeah.
looking into it in more sort of personal detail, and I'm thinking about the characters. I suppose in some ways, people reading this today might look on them as being a little bit two-dimensional because there isn't a
Yes.
lot of character development as such. And Manfred, for instance, is like the demonic anti-hero. He's cunning and ambitious. He's lustful in his want of Isabella. He's really cruel to his wife, who is very good, pious woman who's so kind to him. And he seems to have very little emotion about the death of his son. Um, what about other characters in the book? And I suppose I'm thinking about, the archetypes of it. And what do you think about the role of women in this novel?
Yes. So I think you make a great point. And before we think about the women, I think readers coming to it today will find it slightly absurd. I think
Mm,
we'll find it slightly camp,
quite funny,
because
actually. Yes.
it's quite funny. Yeah, it is. And probably not what people are expecting when they think traditionally of a Gothic novel. We think of got the
Mm,
Gothic as something about anxiety and fear. But as we'll probably explore on this conversation today, there are lots of the core components of the Gothic in there. And I think you're right to focus on the women of the novel because I think it's doing quite a lot about the female characters. So, we have in Isabella the traditional Gothic heroine
yes.
from the outset. She's virtuous, she's vulnerable, but she resists. She's the classic maiden in distress,
Yes,
isn't she,
absolutely. Yeah.
Isabella? Um, and yet, she, she resists Manfred's authority, doesn't she? And she refuses to become a victim of his incestuous desires. She also acts with some agency and some intelligence. So
Mm,
she is kind of reflecting some of the characteristics of the romantic heroine that we
yes.
observe in Richardson's contemporary work, Fielding's contemporary work.
Mm,
So she's an interesting character
yeah,
in her own
definitely.
right. Um, I I think you're very right to kind of pick up Hippolyta as well, the dutiful wife figure, because she's the kind of idealized um,
Mm,
18th century woman, isn't she? She's an obedient, feminine character. She has Christian patience. She shows extreme submissiveness, offering to step aside so that Manfred can remarry. If you
yes,
remember
I actually
in
feel
the
very sorry
novel,
for her
so
actually.
that
And,
kind
and yeah, she's amazingly long suffering. And then at the end, off she goes with him, to go into a house of piety to live out the
yes,
rest of her. But she'd probably be quite happy in a nunnery. I think she'd be quite happy. I'm not sure about
I
him.
think she would. Yes, I think
Yeah.
she would. No, well, yeah, yeah. We can maybe come back to Manfred, and then of course there's Matilda, the tragic daughter, who's really the kind of the
Mm,
novel symbol of innocence and moral beauty, and she's the foil to Isabella. I think that kind of figure of quiet strength and fatal loyalty, and of course all the unspoken love that she has for Theodore,
there's always quite a
uh,
funny
and of
thing,
course,
isn't there? Oh, sorry, Tim. Sorry to interrupt you there.
no, go on,
Well, I was just going to
no,
say, there's almost
go
a
on.
funny little interlude in the book when the two young women are having this discussion almost about, both of them being in love, really.
Yes.
and with the same person, and one maybe is more deserving than the other, and it's quite an interesting little interlude that.
Yes. And it is, I know I come back to it, but I'm really interested in the Gothic's relationship with the romantic movement. And
Mm,
you do see these romantic heroine figures. As I said in Richardson's work, and Clarissa is a really good example of that. You know, these noble, self-effacing, vulnerable, innocent, and yet resisting characters. And while we think about these characters as kind of Gothic archetypes, of course, they were there already as
yes,
broader literary archetypes. It's very
definitely.
interesting. Yeah.
Definitely. And going back through many centuries as well,
Yes,
definitely. Um,
absolutely.
so leading on from that, thinking about, the cover of your book, Gothic Precarity, it's a stunning image. I've seen the cover, and it depicts a burning forest, which is quite appropriate for today, really, because it's
Yeah.
over 30 degrees here. But with that idea in mind, can we talk about this trope in Gothic literature of using the weather and natural settings with those events in the weather, creating atmospheres that actually enhance the mood and the trauma and heighten the whole thing about Gothic literature? I mean, I think Horace Walpole himself employs it to some good effect when, towards the end of the story, there's a storm that occurs, and lightning bolt hits the castle, and it sort of crumbles around everybody, which I think, if that could be a very, very forceful image. I really did think, wow, that's a strong image. But there are many other stories in which the weather is used, and for myself, I think about Wuthering Heights, where, of course, you've got the windswept moors and the extremes between the summer and the winter, and it's like hell and heaven. And
Yes.
there's one scene where a bolt of lightning strikes a tree, which then falls onto a chimney of the house. And that happens at a moment of great trauma when Heathcliff has left. Catherine realizes he's gone and that he's heard her saying that she's going to marry Edgar. And so that's a really traumatic scene. Um, but also, I mean, in real life, whether has affected literature. I'm thinking about Lord Byron and Percy and Mary Shelley at the Villa Diodati in 1816, when the weather was so bad, literally because of a volcano erupting and the ash making the air so dark and
Yes.
cold and wet, that they had to stay inside quite a lot. And to amuse themselves, they read stories from a phantasmagoria. And then Byron suggested a competition that they all write a ghost story. And what
Yes.
what
Yes.
came the seed of that was when Mary Shelley began to think about Frankenstein. So that
Yes.
really is another story in which the power of nature is an electricity, thunderstorms, that electric vital spark is really harnessed. So what
Yes.
about you, Tim? Are there any stories, apart from the Castle of Otranto, that you feel really have affected you in their description of the weather?
Oh, very much so. And I mean, I think you're so right to highlight this as a characteristic of the Castle of Otranto because weather plays such an important symbolic and atmospheric role in the novel. Um, More than a realistic or detailed one, really. Weather is operating on a symbolic level rather than a kind of realist
Mm,
level. So, thinking about this issue, this kind of the weather playing a role um, in engaging with events within a novel. So you talked about Wuthering Heights already, but the one I think that I always think about is Jane Eyre and the use
yeah.
of weather in Jane Eyre, particularly rain, lightning, and storms, quite often accompany turning points in Jane's life. And I'm sure you remember this, but the point at which um, Jane and Rochester first become engaged, there's a thunderstorm that
Mhm.
splits the chestnut tree.
Yes.
So what an omen, what a
Yes.
portent is that? And I think both Emily and Charlotte Bronte use weather. We talk about pathetic fallacy, don't we? We talk about this as a concept where the weather is either foreshadowing or reflecting strong emotion or
Yes.
events within the novel. And I think you're quite right. Wuthering Heights does it, The Castle does it, but that's the one for me. When you pose the question, it's Jane Eyre that does it for me.
Yeah, brilliant. Those wonderful Brontes. So,
Yes.
what do you think about the setting of the Castle of Otranto? It's very, very Gothic in its style, with ornate doorways and arches, looming towers draped in foliage that's growing rampantly. And in the 18th century, buildings of this kind would have been viewed by wealthy young aristocrats who travelled around Europe on their grand tours. So a lot of them, I think, must have emulated those styles that they found when they came home, or decorated their homes with things, artifacts they brought back with them. And obviously, one of the finest examples is Walpole's Strawberry Hill House. That is very monastic in some aspects, with chapels, tombs, passageways, very much in a way how you'd imagine the Castle of Otranto. But beyond this imagery, do you think there's what this sort of idea of monastic abbeys, churches, passages, cloisters? What's the religious significance of this, and the sort of what you get in so many Gothic novels, monks wandering around or ghosts?
Yes. Again, I think you're right. Religion is really important in the Castle of Otranto, and religion is deeply woven into these themes of legitimacy, fate, guilt, morality. It's not a theological novel, but it uses Christian imagery a lot and institutions, and exactly as you described, they're shaping the Gothic atmosphere, but they're also supporting the moral structure of the narrative. That's what
Mhm.
that there's a lot of morality
Yeah.
in the novel, and I think one of the things it's doing, and I think about this quite a lot in terms of the Gothic villain, the religion in the novel is operating as a moral compass, which is contrasting with Manfred's own tyrannical behavior.
Mm.
Manfred is a completely immoral character. He's a tyrant, he's an abuser, an oppressor. So the religion is very much kind of standing as a contrast to that. And it's very interesting when we think about the Gothic. We think about it as a potentially subversive form,
Mm.
but actually, in many ways, it's not.
Mm.
And the reason I say that when we think about religion is because Otranto is a really good example. Ultimately, the novel restores the moral and religious order.
Yes.
You know, wickedness is rejected and punished, and goodness and virtue are rewarded.
Yeah.
Um, it's not particularly a subversive take. So and like Theodore is a really good example of that. Theodore's kind of legacy and inheritance is revealed, and the corrupt line is extinguished. In line with providential justice. So I think religion is underpinning the novel's moral universe.
Definitely. That's a brilliant answer. Thank you so much. And moving on from religion, but related, I think, there's a strong emphasis on magic forces and going back to ghosts again in the Castle of Otranto, because we have visions and prophecies and omens directing the destinies of the characters. And it reminds me a little bit of that Fey influence we get in Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen, and also Shakespeare's Winter's Tale, where you have a statue that comes to life. But are there other books or films where this sense of alchemy in the Gothic has impressed itself on you?
Yeah. So again, it's a really interesting question because um, I think particularly Spenser and Shakespeare, there's a real stylistic and thematic resonance with the romantic elements of the novel, and in kind of this the kind of pre-enlightenment mode of literature. So there's a lot of moral allegory in Spenser. There's a lot of dramatic intensity in Shakespeare, and I think Walpole is aiming to legitimize the literary aspects of his novel by evoking those forms. And you can definitely see, I think you're absolutely spot on with your references to the Fairy Queen, because you can absolutely see how Walpole is inspired by medieval romance conventions,
Yeah,
knights, castles,
yes, definitely.
enchanted objects, ancient prophecy, um, the moral meaning being embedded in symbolic forms, and the kind of atmosphere of chivalry or chivalry and nostalgia, nostalgia for chivalry, spiritual testing. So there's a lot of Spenser, I think, in Otranto. There's definitely a lot of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
The kind of use of ghosts and omens. This is really reflecting Hamlet,
Mm,
Macbeth, Richard III. All this stuff about psychological turmoil and grit, guilt. These are very, very key Shakespeare tragic villain
yeah.
characteristics who are driven
Yeah.
by ambition, haunted by fate, undone by its own nature, and kind of all the bombastic dialogue as well that kind of elevates it, heightens it. So I think you're absolutely right. I think you can see the kind of resonances of this pre-Enlightenment literature coming through. And I
Mm,
guess, Essie, what it does is it's what where I kind of I always think about it. It places the novel in a historic concept. It's shaped by what's happened and what's been written, but it's also anticipating, as you say, it's anticipating what will now come at the
yeah.
beginning of this Gothic movement. And that's why it almost sits at this crossroads, I think. It's just a fascinating thing to talk
Mm.
about.
I think it would be really interesting to actually do an episode on Hamlet and Macbeth at some point. That I was just thinking that would be so interesting. Um, but really, I think our time's beginning to run out. Um, I think we barely scratched the surface of the Castle of Otranto, really.
Barely,
But we will come back, and I hope you'll come
barely
back
scratched.
a guest another time when we talk about other things. But what I'd like you to tell us is thinking now about your own love for the Gothic genre, because I know you really do love it and you're very well read in it. But also, I'm just thinking, is there one book or painting or film or even a piece of music or more than one, that you would like to recommend to our listeners today? Something that they might go away and think about and go and look up for themselves.
Yes, there is. So, you're quite right. I read a lot, and I read a lot of Gothic literature, both 18th century, 19th century, and more modern day works. The work that I wanted to recommend to you and your listeners was The Loney
Oh yeah.
by Andrew Michael Hurley.
Mm.
And it's the story of a pilgrimage, and it's a story of two brothers, one who's mute, the other is his lifelong protector, and they go to the northwest coast on a religious pilgrimage, which has ultimately fairly horrific consequences. Um, and just very quickly, why is it an amazing novel? The novel setting, this stretch of the English coast, is quintessentially Gothic. It's bleak, it's isolated, it's filled with natural dangers. The landscape itself is this character, it's a brooding presence. Like you were talking about Wuthering Heights earlier.
Mm.
The way the moors are a brooding presence in Wuthering Heights. This northwest coast is in the Loney. Interestingly, in terms of the Castle of Otranto, it's a novel about religious obsession and spiritual unease. So in it, Hurley explores Catholicism as a source of comfort, but crucially also as a vessel of fear, ritual, control. The mother is a religious zealot, and there's a lot about fanaticism. The thing I like about it most of all is its ambiguity. It we never quite know what we observe and experience is real. Is it a miracle? Is it truly supernatural? Is it psychological? But it's deeply uncanny. And then there's a lot about repression, the past kind of being only barely concealed and kind of erupting and affecting the present. All of this aligns with what I think what the Gothic does best of all, which is this obsession with the past and the way it can shape and haunt the present and the future. So, if you're looking for a Gothic fiction, a Gothic work with real psychological depth, The Lonely by Andrew Michael Hurley would be my very strong
Thank
recommendation.
you. I think that's a brilliant recommendation. I have read it, but a long time ago when it first came out, and I'm going to read it again, definitely. So thank you, Tim. Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. And as I said, I look forward to you talking to us again when your book comes out. And hopefully maybe other episodes too. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been lovely. Thank you.
And finally, thank you, the listeners, for joining me and Tim Rideout today. And hopefully, we will have lured you into wanting to come back again for the next instalment of Talking the Gothic.